Hello, everyone. Welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed, and I will be your host for today's discussion. I have with me Peter Shambrook. He is an independent scholar and historical consultant to the Britain-Palestine project. Peter, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Lovely to have a chat with you.
Yeah, so Peter, he has a PhD in modern Middle Eastern history from the Faculty of Oriental Studies, Cambridge. And over the course of his career, he has held a number of research positions, including at Durham University and the Center for Lebanese Studies in Oxford. He is the author of French Imperialism in Syria, 1927 to 1936. I've asked Peter to join us because he's published a new book, Policy of Deceit, Britain and Palestine, 1914 to 1939. As you're probably aware, we are doing a number of conversations in a series of conversations in leading up to Palestine Book Awards 2025. And Peter's book is one of the books that was entered into this year's PBA. And I'm really delighted to have him on the show to discuss his new book. So Peter, if I may just begin with, why did you want to write the book? What motivated you? Given there's so many other books out there on this very topic, the policy, Britain's deceit in Palestine, what made you want to re-enter this discussion and publish this new book?
Good question. When I started, I wasn't planning to write a book. I was asked about 10 years ago, I was asked to give a brief talk about Britain's policy in the Middle East during the First World War. And in particular, to look at the sort of legacy of the contradictory, so-called alleged contradictory promises that we made to the French, to the Arabs, to the Jewish community, global community during that period, and its legacy during the British occupation. So this was about 10 years ago. So I went into the I looked at a lot of the secondary literature, the published books and articles on the period. And as you say, it is a very, very, not just a well-plowed field, it's an over-plowed field of research. So the point that intrigued me about Britain's period in the Middle East, or towards the Middle East in 1914, 1918, was that the promises such as the Sykes-Picot Agreement or the Balfour Declaration or the Anglo-French Declaration in November 1918, they were all very thoroughly researched, and historians of all kinds, pro-Zionist, anti-Zionist, pro-imperial, anti-imperial, and then mainstream historians who didn't seem to have a kind of ideological bent. They all had their opinions about all these promises, except the promise of the British to Sharif Hussein in October 1915. And the thing that intrigued me was that mainstream historians, distinguished historians, I would say distinguished historians who mainstream historians, like Albert Harani, like Ian Black, and others, when it came to the Hussein correspondence issue, they were very non-committal, and they said, well, it could be this and it could be that, and the issue will not be resolved necessarily because the language in the correspondence, which was all in Arabic, is disputable, debatable, etc., etc. So the question was, fundamentally, the pro-Palestinian historians, and quite a lot of some mainstream historians like Avi Schleim said that Palestine in this correspondence of 1915 was promised to Sharif Hussein. And pro-Zionist historians like Eli Kaduri and Isaiah Friedman said Palestine was definitely not included in the promise to the Sharif in 1915. So I felt uncomfortable about just giving a 20-minute brief talk. It's much easier to give a 45 minutes than 20 minutes, but to give a 20-minute talk on these issues, where I would be saying, and that's what I did say, on the one hand, this historian says this, and on the other hand, this historian says this, and on the one hand, I wanted to try and get to the bottom of it. So I went into the archives in Kew, and I started looking at the documents, and I started looking at the Arabic letters, the original, or perhaps original in inverted commas.
10-page document, 10-page correspondence. Is that the one that you mentioned?
There were 10 letters. There were 10 letters.
Yeah.
It's more than 10 pages.
Yeah.
10 letters exchanged in Arabic between the British High Commissioner in Cairo, Sir Henry McMahon, and Sharif Hussein in Mecca, who was 800 miles away, between July 1915 and March 1916. So I didn't go into the archives looking for deceit or double dealing or British perfidy or anything else like that. It was just a mystery to me. It was just, and as it seems to have been for a lot of what I would call mainstream historians. So it was a bit like a rat's tail, where I started in the documents and started reading the documents. I started reading documents from British documents, Colonial Office, Foreign Office, Cabinet records from basically June 1916, which was when the Zionist organization in London, Chaim Weizmann and friends, started talking to senior British officials about the possibility of some sort of Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so I to cut a long story short, the longer I spent in the archives looking at all these documents about Palestine during the war, the more intrigued I became. And for the first year or so, I just became increasingly confused. But eventually, after 3 or 4 years of digging around, I ended up with 10,000 photographs on my computer of relevant Foreign Office, Colonial Office, and Cabinet Office records on Palestine and Palestine policy during this period between 1914 and 1939, and a whole sort of series of characteristics emerged. And so by the end of it, that's when I finally decided that I would call my book Policy of Deceit. But as I say, I didn't go into the archives looking for deceit. It was just, when you read my book, you'll see it's just peppered with source-based evidence of not just deceit, but also denial, double dealing, half-truths, a huge mixture of standard imperial great power vocabulary.
So before you set about writing your book, had you already concluded, having looked at all the evidence, that Britain did actually promise or include Palestine to the Arabs during the Hussein McMahon correspondence? Is that something you had concluded 100%, or during your research you discovered
not
that?
At all. No, absolutely not. I mean, if you read Ian Black's books and Albert Hourani's books and people like that, and you take serious note of what they say or what they don't say, or if they're sitting on the fence, then there probably is a tremendous mystery about Hussein McMahon. Obviously, Albert Hourani had Arabic, and somebody like Ian Black, the great late Ian Black, had both Arabic and Hebrew, etc. So it was simply just. But what among other things, the things that emerged were that the British themselves interpreted at the beginning, from 1915-16 through to about 1920, the British officials, series of them, including McMahon, concluded and interpreted the correspondence as promising Palestine, together with the rest of Syria and a huge independent state, to the Arabs. It was only in 1920, 2 years after the end of the war, when Lord George's government had fundamentally decided and really committed themselves to a pro-Zionist British policy in Palestine, that the interpretation of the correspondence and the promise was fundamentally questioned and rejected by Churchill and Balfour and Lord George later.
So by 1920 then, so how did they at the time then reconcile because you mentioned in another book that Palestine was twice promised. It was promised to the Jews and then it was promised to the Arabs, and the promise to the Jews was made in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. So if the interpretation up until 1920 was that it was promised to the Arabs, how did they reconcile the Balfour Declaration with the Hussein McMahon? Or was there or were they simply talking to two different audiences? One is to deceive the Jewish community, but history turned out to be where it favored the Jewish Zionist cause. Or were they simply deceiving the Arabs? But in your case, you're saying they didn't. They actually intended to give Palestine to the Arabs. Were there discussion at the time to reconcile the two promises?
No. What they discussed was that they all agreed that it was impossible to reconcile all the promises, but that was their private discussion that I was reading about. When to understand the correspondence, to understand the Balfour Declaration, all these promises were made in the heat of war, and all the promises were made fundamentally in order to gain a strategic edge militarily and diplomatically over the enemy in order to win the war. So if the war if Gallipoli in the spring of 1915 had succeeded in knocking out the Ottoman Empire, which it didn't, there wouldn't have been any negotiations with the Sharif, and there wouldn't have been negotiations with the Zionist organization. It would have been so. The reason that McMahon started the correspondence with Sharif was in order to try and deal with the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire was still fighting. And the British thought, well, if we can get the Arabs to rise up in the southern edge of in the Hijaz and in the southern edge of the Ottoman Empire, that will mean that Ottoman troops hold up there, and it will it will ease the situation for us in Western Europe. The British, when they made this offer, fundamentally what the British did was they offered Sharif Hussein an independent Arab state, which included all of Greater Syria, the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean, going up to the Taurus Mountains, and part of Iraq, and 90%, 95% of the Saudi, what is now the Saudi Peninsula, and the Sharif agreed to commit treason and revolt on the basis that the British would support the establishment of an independent Arab state, including Palestine. So fundamentally, what happened was that these, as far as the British were concerned, this correspondence was written on water. They had no reason to believe that Arab nationalism would ever take off, and Grey, Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister at the time, said that this correspondence was basically a castle in the air, And McMahon from Cairo said this correspondence will not bind our hands. And so on. So they didn't take the correspondence seriously. They just sent these letters in Arabic down to the Sharif in order to entice him to rebel against the Ottoman garrisons that were in Taif, in Medina, in Mecca, and
the way I read it, the way I read it is just they said what was need to be said to entice the Arabs to do what was required for them to do in order to win the war. In this case, beat the Ottomans. And with the case of
not to beat the Ottomans, because the British never considered militarily. Everything was done. They looked at maps. Everybody had maps. Okay, everybody had maps. St. Petersburg had maps. Berlin had maps, Vienna had maps, Paris had maps, London had maps, etc. And so so the British, when they enticed the Sharif to rebel, didn't expect the Sharif or his revolt to move much beyond the Hijaz. They just thought it might pepper the Turkish army, the Ottoman army, which had plenty of Arabs in it at the time because they were conscripted, as you know. So it might weaken the southern edge of the Ottomans, but they didn't expect, the Ottoman Empire to collapse just because of the revolt. The British were very aware that from the end of the 19th century, from the 1880s, 1890s, the Germans with the Kaiser had been training the Ottomans. So the Ottoman army was a relatively modern army. It wasn't quite the French army or the German army, but it was a pretty sort of European style army with artillery and machine guns and so on. And the British knew perfectly well that the Arabs in Hijaz were there were plenty of rifles, but they were old rifles, which is why you had eventually the whole business with Lawrence of Arabia and guns and gold and grain and everything going into the Hijaz from the British and the Red Sea in order to support the rebellion by Hussein and his Ibn Hussein and his sons. So what I found and what I discovered in the archives when I went through the documents were a number of things, but one was that it wasn't just McMahon originally who said that Palestine had been included in the promise to the Sharif, but also General Maxwell, who was the head of the British Army in Cairo, and a bit later Arnold Toynbee, who became a well-known professor of history and commentator on world affairs, who was a young man in the Foreign Office political department of the intelligence in the Foreign Office just after the war. All these people, and the War Office as well. The War Office, there's a document from the War Office which also interprets the correspondence as promising the Palestine region as well as everything else to the Sharif. So the British were under no illusions about what they had promised, although they didn't take the promise seriously, because they didn't take the Arabs seriously, because Britain was still the largest, or one of the largest, great powers in the world at the time, even if the States and Germany and one or two other places were coming up fast. And in terms of a war and in terms of the spoils of war, the spoils of war would be divided basically by the number of bayonets that you had. Okay, and they knew that the Arabs had hardly any bayonets. So they didn't take this promise to the Arabs seriously whatsoever.
But
Okay.
just to focus on the people who are on the fence, the scholars who are on the fence on this issue, you've
Yes.
added evidence to the and weight to the claim that Palestine was promised to the Arabs.
Yes.
But how could it? I mean, one could say, how could it not have been so? I mean, why would the Arabs then rise up and revolt against the Ottomans if they did not believe that it was included? They must have been given the impression, or there must have been some kind of pledge from the
Yes.
British in a document.
Yes.
So, of course, the historical weight, the weight of evidence you've uncovered supports that claim. But logically also, I mean, you would not, people would not rise up if they did not think Palestine, or the Arabs would not have risen up if they did not think Palestine was going to be part of the territory which they would control
Yeah.
after the
Yes.
Ottomans had collapsed. So
Yes.
it supports a logical
Yeah.
argument, doesn't it?
The Sharif, and his two sons, the two sons in particular, he had four sons, but the two sons in particular, Abdallah and then Faisal, the third son, they absolutely they received this document, which was the famous letter, the debatable letter, of the 24th of October 1915. They received this in Arabic in Mecca, and it very clearly said. And the Sharif was absolutely right to consider that Palestine, although it was very important in terms of Islamic terms and so on, but it's geographically a very small portion of the independent Arab state that the Sharif was promised. Very tiny place, relatively speaking. No, they went to war eventually in June 1916. They rebelled in June 1916 on the basis of this correspondence, and just quite how naive they were or astute they were in terms of really understanding what the British and the French were in terms of empires and what they would plan to do in terms of replacing the Turks rather than providing and giving the Arabs their independence. That's another whole conversation. But they got as much of a guarantee as they thought possible. And so eventually the Sharif decided to go for it. There are lots of other issues involved in this in terms of the motives of the Sharif. The Sharif, you have to understand the development of what you might call Arab nationalism within the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire following the 1908 Young Turks Revolution in Istanbul. And by 1914, among other issues and among other factors, the Sharif had intercepted a letter from the Ottoman authorities, basically saying that the Sharif was showing too many signs of wanting a more independent area in the Hijaz and sort of semi-autonomy from the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans were planning to depose the Sharif. It was only because of the outbreak of the war that they let the Sharif stay where he was in Mecca. Okay, so that was another element in the decision making of the Sharif. So yes, so they when you go through the documents, as I did all the way through to 1939, after the war, and we can discuss the question of the why Britain became a sort of had a pro-Zionist policy from about 1920 onwards. But apart from that, there was a handful of pro-Arab MPs in Parliament during the period. There were perhaps, and it's impossible to count, but there were perhaps 30, 40 or more either Jewish or MPs who were supporters of the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so this small handful of MPs who were what you might call pro-Arab, every so often would ask the government in Parliament, in the House of Commons, would the government please publish the Hussein McMahon correspondence, as the government has published and as is in the public eye all the other promises that the British made. And in particular, these questions came up whenever there were disturbances in Palestine, namely in 1920, in 1921, in 1929, and then when there was the big Arab revolt in 1936, there would always be questions in Parliament. And so between 1920 and 1939, there were in the House of Commons requests, official requests from MPs to publish the correspondence, the Hussein McMahon correspondence. And this happened 24 times. I went through all the records. And there were 24 refusals by the British government, by a succession of British government. They would not publish the Hussein McMahon correspondence until 1939. And why they did so in 1939 is another story. I'm happy to talk to you about that. But between 1920 and 1939, the British government, a succession of British governments, refused to publish the correspondence. And when I looked at the internal records and their discussions why they were not agreed to or would not publish the correspondence, it was absolutely clear in their conversations. They knew, the successive British governments knew, and the Foreign Office knew, the Colonial Office knew, all the officials knew that if there was a discussion in Parliament over the correspondence, once it was published, they would be made to look ridiculous, because the correspondence clearly showed that Palestine was included in the promise to the Sharif.
If I may just ask a question on that, was there also the case that if those correspondence were published, then it may have derailed British commitment to Zionism, which
that is the whole point. Okay. That is the whole point. That is the whole point. It would undermine the sort of moral and political soundness of the other promises, where, for instance, the Sykes-Picot promise of May 1916, which was after the promise to the Arabs, that was in terms of Palestine, because the British and the French couldn't agree on the future of Palestine, they coloured it in a different colour on the map, the two of them, Sykes and Picot. And the idea was that in the Sykes-Picot agreement, the written agreement between the British and the French, because it's all written out in English and in French, the correspondence of Sykes-Picot, the Palestine region was going to be administered by an Anglo-French, essentially an Anglo-French condominium. Okay, in other words, the French would be involved as well as the British in the future of Palestine. And then, of course, we promised the same region to the global Jewish community in November 1917. And then when we actually liberated in inverted commas, and defeated the Turks and drove them northwards during 1918, the British and the French government issued a public declaration saying that we are here to liberate you, not to occupy you, and we will establish, our aim is to establish local governments and national governments in these areas, including Palestine, the whole of Syria, Greater Syria, governments which are the reflection of the will of the local populations. But of course, the British and the French had absolutely no intention of consulting the local populations. But that's another element of deceit.
Can I pick up on our earlier conversation about the strategic framework of these documents? So we mentioned that the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, Balfour Declaration, these and the other pledges, they were made within the context of Britain seeking to win the war. So I guess the Balfour Declaration is also, I mean, from my reading, the Balfour Declaration was issued partly because Britain thought there was anti-Semitism behind their thinking, which is that they could co-opt the global Jewish community who had a huge sway over politics, and they could use them to win the war against the Germans and the British. Be that as it may, I mean, at what point did they commit to the Balfour Declaration? Because if we're saying that in 1916, 1917, Britain is making all these promises to all these different constituencies to advance their, advance their goal in winning the war. At what point did they say, no, we will commit to the Balfour Declaration? And why did they commit to the Balfour Declaration, not the other one? What was the main reason? Is it because the Jewish community were able to, international Jewry was able to seize on the Balfour Declaration and start lobbying and demand Britain actually, enforce that policy on Palestine? What were the main reasons?
No, Britain, British officials, Sir Mark Sykes, and the Zionist organization in London under Chaim Weizmann started talking together privately in the summer of 1916. Okay, just at the time of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was secret and which Chaim Weizmann sort of found out about, but was not officially informed of it, okay, in the summer of 1916. And the Balfour Declaration came about through 18 months then, 18 months from the summer of 16 through to November 1917, 18 months of intense negotiations between senior British officials and the Zionist organization. And all sorts of drafts went back and forth. And the Americans were involved, including Louis Brandeis. So just exactly who wrote the final declaration, which it wasn't Balfour. Balfour just signed the documents. He was not particularly involved in all the word by word negotiations of what the declaration would contain, the 67 words that it would contain. So there were all sorts of drafts. In particular, there was a big draft in July 1917, and the reasons why the British government were intrigued, it was partly, as you say, anti-Semitic, because Lord George had this anti-Semitic idea that the Zionists and the global Jewish community basically had a huge influence financially on the war, including in places like Germany and Austria. Jewish financiers in Germany and Austria. So the declaration itself was the product of anti-Semitic ideas by the Prime Minister, Lord George, but also there were strategic arguments in the sense that the British wanted to. They looked at America, and America had just come into the war. America came into the war in April 1917, but the Congress was very reluctant to really get going to support the British in the war in Europe for a whole variety of reasons. So the funds that the British were hoping to get from America were very sluggish and were not really coming through, although the Americans had officially joined the war. So it was a strategic, financial, political motive to try and really encourage the Americans to rev up their enthusiasm, and the Congress to rev up its enthusiasm to send funds and to lend money to the war effort in Europe. And the Zionist organization in London promised the British government that we will do, if you give us a declaration about Palestine, we will do all in our power with our influence in Congress and in the press in America and everything else like that to really rev up and get these funds released and get America fully into the war. Russia was a bit similar in the sense that there had been in 1917 there was a sort of revolution in Russia, an initial bourgeois revolution in Russia, and Lenin and Kerensky and Trotsky and quite a lot of the Bolshevik and Menshevik leadership in Russia were Jewish. And so the British also were very, very keen to keep the Russian army in the war, because the Russian army was basically falling apart by the end of 1916. And once that happened, once the Russians were out of the war, it would have meant that the Austrians and the Germans could turn their attention to the West and put more pressure on the British and the French in the West, in France and so on. So there were strategic reasons for issuing the Balfour Declaration. But it was certainly not because the British government had any sort of sympathy for Jews or the persecuted Jews from the pogroms or anything else like that. In fact, you need to remember that Balfour himself was he had been converted, you might say, to Zionism by his conversations with Chaim Weizmann, political Zionism. But I don't think he had a particular affection for the Jewish community as such. He was prime minister between 1902 and 1905. And during that period, around 1900 and the turn of the century, there were riots in Britain because, and in particular in London, because of the great influx of mostly Jewish refugees fleeing from the pogroms in Tsarist Russia, right? So the stability of London and the government were shaken a little bit by these riots. So it was Balfour who passed legislation in 1903 in the House of Commons, which was the first aliens bill restricting immigrants coming into Britain and providing quotas. And this was basically anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish legislation. Okay, and so that was Balfour. That's what he did. And I might tell you that this aliens bill, 1903, was the first time that immigration had ever been officially legislated and stopped in the history of the Parliament of Great Britain. Okay, so Balfour was no friend of the Jewish community. Neither was Lord George, etc., etc. Churchill was a different kettle of fish. He came a bit later. He was not in the cabinet in 1917.
Yeah, I guess the question I was asking, I mean, of course, at the outset, the reasoned motivations behind the Balfour Declaration were not really because they were the British officials loved Jews. It was more to do with, as I said, their aspirations to win the war and co-opt the world Zionist community. But the question I'm asking is, why did they then, after 1920, as you say, push forward with why did they include the Balfour Declaration within the British mandate, for example? Why did they do that? Why did that become British policy, the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine? If it was simply a document to win the war, First World War, why then, when British was granted the mandate by the League of Nations, why did they incorporate the Balfour Declaration? Because as your book shows, you know, McMahon, Balfour Declaration, these were all really documents which were essentially to deceive their audiences to further British agenda in the First World War.
Defeat was just part of collateral damage. It was just part of standard imperial vocabulary. Because when you're in power and you have a huge amount of power, you don't worry too much about the fallout of saying untruths because the powerless can't do much about it. In terms of policy, post-war policy, Lord George was not what you might call a born-again Christian Zionist. He was a land grabber, so to speak, and he could see the advantage to the British Empire of having a Jewish colony on the eastern flank of the Suez Canal. You have to understand maps and strategic considerations and military considerations. The Suez Canal was absolutely vital in terms of transporting troops, for instance, during the First World War. During the First World War, there were, among other things, 400,000 Muslim troops in the Indian Army. Now, the way to get the Indian Army to fight in the trenches, which is what they did, or some of them, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, was to transport them from Bombay and places through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, etc., and around Spain, and then into the trenches. If they'd had to go around Africa, it would have been a huge operation. So the Suez Canal was always so Lord George, who was Prime Minister until October 1922, one of his motivations for continuing with the whole Balfour scheme and Balfour Declaration was to install a increasing number of Jewish colonists in Palestine. There were other motives too, because they were basically, there was tremendous rivalry with the French, okay, and the French had a lot of assets, so to speak, as did the British and the Russians and the Italians in Palestine and in Lebanon, and in particular the French had in Lebanon, in what became Lebanon in 1920. So the Brits wanted basically to keep the French northwards. They wanted to keep the French out of Palestine, and one way of doing that was to support the idea of helping these persecuted Jews from the pogroms and everywhere else to develop a homeland in Palestine, and that would protect. They would be allies of the British, and they would protect the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. You have to understand. Look at the map. Between the Hijaz and what is now Gaza, so to speak. If you go westwards towards Egypt and towards the Suez Canal, you've got 120 miles or so of the Sinai, and there's almost no water there. You've got El Arish, but there's almost no water there. So, in terms of a buffer state or a buffer militarily buffer zone to protect the Suez Canal, the Sinai, the 120 odd miles of the Sinai, were almost impossible to, you couldn't keep troops there. You couldn't have a military operation there of any size. You could conquer it and go through it one way or another if you had enough water, but otherwise you couldn't keep it. A bit like the Americans in Afghanistan, you just can't. You can bomb it, but you can't occupy and keep it.
So I guess the First World War persuaded, if any persuasion was required, Britain needed to have kind of a Jewish Ulster in Palestine to serve their interest and make sure that Palestine was always in friendly hands, because on the one hand, they're also fearing Arab nationalism, which is why Britain just committed to the creation of a Jewish homeland. But during that phase, did Jewish homeland also mean a Jewish state at that time? Were there discussions amongst British officials that the document itself is also quite ambiguous? There is duplicity in the document, that homeland in their mind Privately, they
Yeah.
actually meant a state, but what they were projecting or presenting to the world is that it's going to be a Jewish homeland in Palestine, meaning Palestine would be a state, and within that state, there would be Jewish homeland. Or were they from the outset thinking, no, we will create a Jewish state? Because that would be another deception, is it? Wouldn't that? That would be another form of deception.
It was a form of deception. There's no doubt about it. In terms of just to go back to in terms of policy, after the declaration was made in November 1917, remember Jerusalem was just then taken in December 1917 by Allenby, and it took another 9 months to move the Turks north. But Weizmann and his colleagues in the Zionist organization did not just rest on their laurels saying, oh, this is, they did basically say this is kind of miraculous because the greatest power in the world has now, is now supporting a possibility of a Jewish homeland. But they basically went into overtime because they knew that at the end of the war, if they won the war, if the British and the Americans and everybody won the war, there would be a rearrangement. There would be a peace conference, and there would be a huge amount of negotiations going on with the defeat of the Ottomans and the defeat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and everything. So they prepared for all of this very meticulously. So during once the end of the war was over, and you had the creation, the development, the establishment of the peace conference in Paris in January 1919, a couple of months after the end of the war, the Zionists sent a delegation. They sent a delegation of about 25 people over to Paris. A lot of them lawyers, multilingual and very clever. And so when the great powers, who were the big three, Clemenceau, Lord George, and Woodrow Wilson, listened to the Zionists, the Zionist organization, they had a very clear, definitive proposal for the future of Palestine. And Balfour, from the end of the war and beginning of 1919, and Balfour himself went to Paris. Balfour ordered the Foreign Office to negotiate and to keep negotiating with the Zionist lawyers, Zionist organization lawyers, and so there were intense negotiations all the way through from 1918 through the Peace Conference of 1919, 1920, 1921, and through to 1922. Negotiations between the Zionist organization and their lawyers and British Foreign Office officials. And so if you go into the documents, and it's all published in what they call the British Foreign Office documents, you will see there is a 30 page draft mandate document already at the end of 1919. And it's very interesting because on one page you've got the Zionist proposals, 29 articles of a draft mandate, and on the opposite side of the page, literally, you have what the British were saying or advocating or allowing. Okay, so there was a whole draft mandate which was very, very similar to what the mandate actually emerged on the 24th of July 1922 eventually. So the British and the Zionists were joined at the hip in terms of developing the Balfour Declaration into what became the mandate document. Okay, the mandate document was the implementation, the absolute total implementation of the Balfour Declaration, and the Zionist organization managed to persuade the British to as you say, put in to include the Balfour Declaration in toto in the preamble of the mandate document. So that was a huge success, because then the Balfour Declaration, which was not in any way a treaty or anything, it was just not even a promise almost, it was just saying they would support the idea of development of a homeland.
Jewish homeland in Palestine, which
yes,
assumes
now,
that there would be a Palestinian
to
state.
answer your question about the state, did they believe in the state? Yes, this is very clear to me. The reason the reason why it was called to start with, why it was called a Jewish national homeland, that was partly a Zionist idea, because the Zionists and the Congresses before the First World War, they knew that there was no way the great powers would agree to a Jewish state in Palestine, where the Jews were mostly traditional religious Arabic-speaking Jews, and they were all of 7, 8, 9% of the population, and they were mostly non-Zionist, and they owned, the Jewish community pre-1918 owned about 2% of the land area of Palestine. So if you look at the context of the Paris conference and recarving up the boundaries of Europe and everywhere else, and then the British and the French all arguing over the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire and everything, there was no way the British could really, and the Zionist organization knew this, they couldn't really put in on black and white, we want a Jewish state. Now, the key point about deceit is that there is a written record of a meeting in Balfour's home with Lord George and Balfour and Churchill meeting with Chaim Weizmann in 1921. And Weizmann asks them, the three of them, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and 1921, this was Lord George, Churchill had been appointed by Lord George as the Colonial Secretary responsible for Palestine. Chaim Weizmann asked these men privately in Balfour's home, by the declaration, did you mean a Jewish state? And Lord George and Balfour said, yes, we meant a Jewish state, an eventual Jewish state. Okay, so that was very clear. The official vocabulary was a Jewish national home, but the actual intentions of Lord George and Churchill and Lord George and Balfour in 1917 was the eventual creation of a Jewish state. Even though over the years, Weizmann often said publicly that we are not looking for a Jewish state, but that was just tactics.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of deceit there. So I mean, we're nearly coming up to the hour, and it's flown by, to be honest with you. And so we are coming to the end of the show. So I want to end with one final question about the legacy of this deceit. So there's deception at the time of the drafting of the Hussein McMahon report, the Balfour Declaration, and we've understood the context. Now we're at a time where there's genocide in Gaza. Do you see deception as being a core principle, a core strategy in the way the UK is dealing with the Gaza genocide? Because we know there are many refueling planes which are fueling Israeli planes flying over the Gaza Strip, bombing the Gaza Strip. There are British spy planes flying over Gaza. There's many ways in which the UK, you can say, is being complicit in the genocide. So what has been the historical legacy of Britain's deception towards the Palestinian issue all the way up to now in the Gaza Strip? What would you say to that?
Well, I agree with everything you say in terms of current genocide. For those of us old enough, I remember 1969 when the lid came off the dustbin in Northern Ireland, okay, and you had 30 years of mayhem, culminating ultimately, fortunately, in the Good Friday Agreement of some 28 years ago. But nobody in their right minds would look at the origins of why did the Troubles start in 1969 without looking at the previous 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and looking at the partition of Ireland in 1921, which was actually the same time as and the same people. Lord George's settlement of Ireland and partition was the same time as the creation of the Palestine Mandate and so on. So as far as I'm concerned, the die was cast not in 1948, but in 1939. By 1939, with the brutal suppression of the Arab revolt, the Palestinians were leaderless. Their arms had been taken away. The Jewish militias had been armed, and Ben Gurion in his diaries could foresee the possibility of transfer, what he called transfer, of massive numbers of Palestinians out of Palestine in order to create a Jewish state. This was in 1939, and so the Palestinians, as far as the Zionist militias were concerned, and were out of it. So the legacy is very clear. 1948, you had the ethnic cleansing, and after that, the Palestinians and Palestinian nationalism and Palestine as a nation, in a sense, was not on the agenda of the big powers for about 15 years until the mid-60s. They were a refugee issue. And it was only in the mid-60s that Palestinian nationalism, with the creation of the PLO and so on, started up again. But as I say, the die was cast, and the legacy to me is absolutely clear. Now, in terms of what is happening today, I think there is a great deal of complicit policy in the British government towards what is happening. If Starmer, if our Prime Minister was a true statesman, he would immediately recognize the state of Palestine. He would suspend all arms sales to Israel. He would deal very strongly with the Israeli ambassador in this country, one way or another, and the Israeli embassy, and they would suspend all trade with Israel, and they would suspend training Israeli troops. We have, as far as I know, there are Israeli troops, actual Israeli troops being trained and training British forces in this country at the moment. It's not just overflights or intelligence sharing, but basically we are joined at the hip with Israel fundamentally, and we are also joined at the hip in terms of intelligence sharing and everything else with the United States of America. So, and all of this is not really laid out clearly in the British media. It's not laid out clearly in the British media. My own
That's right. I mean, the way I look at it sometimes, sorry to interrupt, it's just like often you see people, to cover up for their original crime, they commit another crime, then they commit another crime, and then soon you realize over the course of history you've committed a series of crimes to cover for the original crime, and they're all exponentially worse and worse and worse until you get to what is now genocide. And Britain cannot extricate themselves from the original crime. It's very, very difficult to do that.
It is very difficult to do that, and I've often wondered, trying to put myself in the shoes of the British officials dealing with Palestine during the 1920s and 1930s, who knew that the British position and British policy was either immoral or the arguments were weak, or what the government was saying was only half-truths, etc., etc. Would I have resigned as an official? And I've sometimes wondered about that, because I might not have resigned. I might not have resigned. If you have a career and a wife and a family and a mortgage and everything else like that. Are you going to resign on a matter of principle? Now, a few officials have done and did do, and a few officials in America and in the Foreign Office have resigned currently at the moment. But it's a big decision to do so. But so personally, I think the British Navy should there should be a call to the British Navy and the French Navy and any other who prefer to do it to sail to Gaza in force with aid. We should stop selling all arms first. We mustn't do what diabolical Biden did, which was selling bombs to Israel and then putting a pier on the coast, and which didn't last very long in terms of aid. That was hypocrisy. That was hypocrisy. It was just incredible. We shouldn't do that. We should stop all the arms, and we should then maybe under the authority or aegis of the United Nations, send 100 destroyers and cruisers and aircraft carriers, and it would be difficult to full of aid, full of medical aid, and full of milk and everything else like that. And I don't see how the Israelis, even with the threat of it, I don't see how the Israelis could stop it. And although it would be difficult because there isn't a deep water harbor in Gaza, even though there isn't, I can't see how there couldn't be some way with helicopters or landing craft or something, if it was big enough, that the
Of course, I mean, if the UK and the US and European countries had the desire and the wish to do that, Israel cannot stop them. Israel is a small country. If anything, Israel relies on Western and American support and their complicity to continue the genocide. Without their support, of course, Israel
but at the moment, no matter how forceful, brilliant Lamy is with his words, how intolerable it is, and everything else like that, it's what I call kalam fadi. Yes.
Yeah.
Kalam fadi, empty words. The Netanyahu takes no notice of declarations either from the UN at the moment or the British and the French. They have no. It's water off a duck's back. So until we actually cause some real heart searching among the Israelis with sanctions of a whole variety, they're going to continue. They're going to continue the genocide.
I agree with you.
And in particular on the West Bank.
That's right. Peter, we've come to the end of our time. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I could have spoken a lot more about your book, but we do have to end. So do purchase Peter's book, Policy of Deceit, Britain and Palestine, 1914 to 1939. So thank you for tuning in, whoever is listening and tuned in. And thank you, Peter, for giving us your time. And see you all for another conversation with the Middle East Monitors soon.
I hope so. And thank you for having me. Thank you. I appreciate it.